Have you ever thought about, like, how many everyday things could actually be dangerous?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, things we just take for granted.
Definitely.
Well, this deep dive takes us back to 1982 when that idea became a terrifying reality in Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine just reaching for a bottle of Tylenol, something everyone has in their medicine cabinet,
Right.
and accidentally, well, not accidentally, but unknowingly taking a lethal dose of cyanide.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. And it's exactly what happened during the Chicago Tylenol murders. We're going to try to unpack this whole case today.
Yeah, this is going to be a tough one.
We got some pretty interesting sources for this one. A detailed academic case study.
Oh, wow.
Some historical accounts, those are always interesting to get a feel for, the time.
Yeah, the context.
Yeah, and some, news articles from back then. On the ground stuff.
Wow. So we're really going deep.
Absolutely. We want to understand how this tragedy unfolded, how a brand like Johnson & Johnson, they're practically synonymous with trust, especially for like kids products.
Right, right.
How do they handle this crisis, and how really did it change like how we think about safety, all these years later?
I mean, it must have been a PR nightmare.
Oh, totally. And, one of the eeriest things about this whole thing is how it all started. It seemed like totally unrelated incidents, like a puzzle where no one even realized they were looking at the pieces.
Yeah.
Just tragic.
Right, like the first victim. She's
Yeah.
just a 12-year-old girl, Mary Kellerman.
Awful.
Her father's words when he found her are just heartbreaking. He said, "I opened the bathroom door and my little girl was on the floor unconscious. She was still in her pajamas."
God. And at first, they had no idea what happened. It was a complete mystery.
I can't even imagine.
And then, within days, 3 more people in Chicago died the same way. It was only when firefighters, they were responding to one of these deaths, and they noticed a bottle of Tylenol. That's when it clicked.
Oh, wow. So random. I mean, in 1982, could you imagine thinking someone would tamper with medicine?
It was unthinkable. People just trusted their medicine. I mean, why wouldn't you?
Right. It was supposed to make you better, not hurt you.
Totally. This case, it really shattered that feeling of safety. It exposed this vulnerability that no one had ever thought about.
And it makes you think, like, what else could be tampered with?
It's scary.
Yeah.
So yeah, investigators focused on Tylenol, and things took a much darker turn.
Oh, I bet.
The toxicology reports, they confirmed there was potassium cyanide in the capsules. Someone was intentionally poisoning these bottles, turning, normal Tylenol into a silent weapon.
That's crazy. And the scariest part, no one knew who was doing it or why.
Right. Imagine that fear. Chicago was gripped by it, and it just spread everywhere. Suddenly, every bottle of Tylenol was suspicious.
It would be hard to trust anything.
Oh, for sure. It wasn't just fear, though. There was also this, disbelief. How could someone do something so random, so senseless? It shook people's faith in everything, really. It felt like anyone could be next.
It's that kind of thing that makes you question humanity.
Absolutely.
So now let's talk about Johnson & Johnson, the company that made Tylenol. They must have been freaking out. Their most famous product, a product built on trust, was now linked to all these deaths. And the person responsible was still out there.
It was, a total nightmare scenario.
So how did they even begin to respond to something that could have honestly destroyed the company?
Well, their response is actually still studied today. It's like a perfect example of how to handle a crisis.
Really?
Yeah. They took action really fast to protect people. But they also made some smart choices that saved their brand.
So what did they do?
Well, first, they got Tylenol off the shelves. And I don't mean like a little warning. They did a massive countrywide recall. 31 million bottles of Tylenol.
Wow. That must have cost a fortune.
Yeah, like $100 million.
Yeah.
Which in 1982, come on, that's a huge amount.
That's commitment. They were serious about making sure people were safe.
Right. It showed everyone they cared more about people than money.
Definitely. But, that couldn't have been all they did.
No. They also started this, huge media campaign to tell everyone what was going on and to give updates about the investigation.
So they were transparent.
Oh, yeah. They did press conferences, public statements, even had their chairman, James Burke, on TV talking directly to the country. You didn't see that kind of thing much back then.
I bet not.
And it worked. Instead of hiding behind lawyers or, PR people, they showed everyone they were human. They acknowledged everyone's fear.
Makes sense.
They didn't downplay anything. They took responsibility. They said they were shocked and horrified, and they promised to do everything they could to find out who did this and to make sure it never happened again.
It's crazy to think some companies would have just tried to blame someone else. Like, hey, this wasn't us. Someone else messed with our product.
Yeah, but Johnson & Johnson didn't do that. They stepped up. They took responsibility, even though they were victims too.
That's impressive.
That's why everyone says they handled this perfectly. Public safety first, transparency, and taking ownership. That's how they kept people's trust, even when everything was so scary.
So they dealt with the right now problem, but then what? Did they just go back to normal?
No way. This is where it gets interesting. The Tylenol murders didn't just change Johnson & Johnson. They changed how we think about safety for everything.
Wow, I never thought of that.
Yeah, it forced the whole pharmaceutical industry, actually all consumer goods manufacturers, to think about tampering.
Oh, that's a big shift.
Before this, packaging was, pretty basic. Anyone could open a bottle, mess with it, and you'd never know. But after the Tylenol murders, everything changed.
So what did they do?
Johnson & Johnson, they worked with the FDA and created tamper-resistant packaging. The triple-sealed, tamper-evident bottles we see everywhere now.
Those little foil seals, the plastic wrap, that's because of this.
Yep. It was direct response to what happened. And it showed how committed they were to preventing another tragedy.
I never realized that.
And it's not just packaging. This whole thing led to the Tylenol bill. It's a federal law that made tampering with consumer products a federal crime.
Wow. So next time I see one of those tamper-resistant packages, I'll have to remember the Tylenol murders and the company that turned tragedy into, a safer world.
It's a pretty incredible story when you think about it. Loss, fear, but also innovation. And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to go even deeper into the investigation, see what the long-term effects of this whole thing were, and look at what it means for corporate responsibility in a world where trust is everything. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, Johnson & Johnson's response. $100 million, just like that. That recall. That wasn't just money, though. Think of the logistics, pulling millions of bottles off every shelf, everywhere.
Yeah, it must have been a complete nightmare. Especially back then, pre-internet. How did they even coordinate something that big?
They were basically inventing crisis communication in real time. They used everything. Press releases, TV. They even had those toll-free hotlines, for people to call in, worried customers.
Right, right.
They even used satellite technology, brand new at the time, to broadcast the press conferences live, reach everyone.
Wow. So this case really changed the way we think about communication and how to deal with a crisis. They had to get creative, the old ways wouldn't cut it.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about putting information out there. It was about listening, responding to what people were actually worried about. Those hotlines, they weren't just for show. There were real people on the other end answering questions, giving reassurance, even counseling.
That's amazing. In the middle of all this chaos, they still managed to be human, to actually care. You don't hear about that side of things very often, but it explains why people trusted them.
It wasn't just about protecting the brand. It was about protecting people. They knew they had to help the community heal. And not just from the poison, but from the fear, too.
That makes sense. That fear must have been so real, living in Chicago back then, not knowing who bit it, if they'd strike again.
Oh, absolutely. It was palpable. People just stopped taking Tylenol. Some stopped taking over-the-counter meds completely. Even going to the drugstore was scary.
It must have felt like your whole world had been turned upside down. And it wasn't just Chicago, right?
Nope. The fear, it spread everywhere. The Tylenol terror, the headlines screamed. Everyone was checking their medicine bottles, looking for signs of tampering.
Wow.
It was a wake-up call, really. Even in a modern society, we're not safe from these random acts. It can happen anywhere, to anyone.
So Johnson & Johnson did damage control. They took steps to stop future tampering. But what about the investigation? Did they ever catch the person who did this?
That's the thing. They never did, despite a huge investigation. Leads, tips. Johnson & Johnson even offered a big reward. But the person was never found.
So even with everything they did, there's still this mystery hanging over the case. I wonder how that affected people's perceptions, even with Johnson & Johnson doing so much to rebuild trust.
You'd think it would have hurt them, right? But people seem to understand they were doing everything they could to find the person, to stop it from happening again. And they were honest about it. They didn't try to hide the fact that the case was unsolved. They kept working with the police, and they kept the public informed.
It really seems like that honesty, that transparency was the key. They didn't try to avoid the tough questions.
Exactly. They let their actions speak. They showed a genuine commitment to transparency, to accountability. That's how they earned back the public's trust, even with the case still open.
It's interesting to compare that to how other companies have acted then and now. So many get defensive, try to minimize things or point fingers, but Johnson & Johnson did the opposite.
They understood that acknowledging the problem, taking responsibility, focusing on solutions, that was the only way to move forward. And it wasn't just a PR trick. It was a real change in how they approached their responsibility to the public.
Wow. And that had a huge impact, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. It became the example of how to handle a crisis. It showed everyone that being transparent and accountable can actually make your reputation stronger in the long run.
It challenged that old way of thinking. The idea that companies should only care about profit. Johnson & Johnson showed that doing the right thing, even if it costs you money, can build trust and loyalty with your customers.
Exactly.
So this case didn't just change how we package things, it changed how we see the relationship between businesses and people. It raised the standards for everyone.
Absolutely. Companies had to rethink their priorities, realize that safety and trust, those are valuable assets, not just something you say you care about when something bad happens.
And that's still relevant today, right? With social media and the news cycle being what it is, companies can't hide anymore. People demand honesty, and they're quick to call out those who aren't being truthful.
The Tylenol case is proof. Being real, actually caring about people, those are the most important things when you're in a crisis.
It's a pretty amazing story how a company took what could have been a complete disaster and not only saved themselves, but also made the world safer.
It makes you think, though. Product tampering still happens. How can we, as consumers, be more careful? What should we be looking for? How can we protect ourselves and our families?
Those are really good questions, and ones we'll keep thinking about as we finish our deep dive into the Tylenol murders and what they mean for us today. It's been really interesting talking about, the big impact of this case, the changes in packaging, the laws, how Johnson & Johnson handled it all.
Right.
But it's easy to forget that this is about people who died, real people.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the bigger picture, but we can't forget the human side of it. 7 people lost their lives. They had families, friends, they had plans for the future.
Yeah. Mary Kellerman, the 12-year-old girl, she was the first. Adam Janus, he was a postal worker, and then the others. It's a reminder that these headlines, they're about real people,
And their families, the people who loved them, their lives were changed forever. And the fear in Chicago back then, it spread through the whole city. It changed how they saw each other, the city itself, even just buying stuff at the store.
Yeah, it really shows that even something random, something violent can affect so many people for a long time.
For sure. And while we can't bring back those who died, we can, I think, try to learn from what happened and try to prevent it from happening again. That's the best way to honor them.
We talked about how Johnson & Johnson responded, but I think it's worth thinking about, the ethics of it all. They had to make some really tough calls. And those decisions, they still affect how we think about, what companies should do, how they should act.
Definitely. One thing that stands out is that they put people's safety first, even before their own money. That recall, $100 million, that was a risk. They didn't know if it would save the brand, if it would even stop more poisonings.
But they did it anyway. And that, I think, told everyone that they valued people more than profit. That's a big deal, especially back then when everyone thought companies only cared about money.
Right. And it set a new standard, I think, for how companies should act. It showed that you can do the right thing, the ethical thing, even when things are bad, even when your whole company's in trouble.
But some people say, that Johnson & Johnson just did it to protect themselves, to save their image, to avoid lawsuits. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, there's always that question. Were they being totally selfless or were they looking out for themselves too? It's probably both, to be honest. But the important thing is that they did something good. They protected people and they showed other companies that this is how you should act.
It's a good reminder that even when it comes to business, doing the right thing matters.
Definitely. And I think more and more people want to see companies do the right thing. They want to know the products they're buying are safe and they want to support companies that, have the same values as they do.
The Tylenol case, it shows that doing good can be good for business, too. When you're ethical, people trust you, and that's good for your reputation. In the end, it's a better way to do business.
Totally agree. It's a win-win, and that's a lesson that's even more important now. People have so many choices these days, and they hold companies accountable for their actions.
So we've talked a lot about this case, but what can we take away from it? What can we learn to help us in a world that's, let's face it, getting more complicated and scary every day?
I think one big thing is that even when things are bad, when we're scared, there's always hope. Johnson & Johnson showed us that. You can take a crisis and make something good out of it.
And they didn't do it alone. The police, the government, the media, and everyone really, they all work together to deal with this, to learn from it, and to make things safer.
And that idea of working together, that's something we can all do. We all have a responsibility to make the world a better, safer place.
We can be smart about what we buy, demand that companies are honest with us, and speak up when things aren't right.
You got it. The Tylenol murders were a horrible thing, but they also showed us how strong people can be, how we can come up with new ideas, and how important it is to keep people safe. It's a story that, well, it still teaches us a lot about responsibility, about working together, and about never giving up hope, even when things seem impossible.
This has been a really, really interesting deep dive. I hope it's made you think about the things you buy, the companies you support, and how we can all make the world a little bit better, a little bit safer.